I mean, I read a lot when I was a teenager. I was very much into art house movies and the French Nouvelle Vague and independent movies and James Joyce. I never read
Wow.
Ulysses. I read the monologue of Molly Bloom at the very end of it, and I read short stories, but never the full book. But I was a very sort of heady child, and I had friends, but I was also kind of a loner. And so I think I just sat in my room and created my own world, and I wrote a lot. I wanted to become a writer. And I wrote screenplays and movies, but it was all sort of fictitious stuff, right? I had a radio show that my poor little brother had to be a guest on. So it's funny how, I mean, I was a very imaginative child in a way. And, this is sort of, I guess, Sir Ken Robinson's thesis, right? Sort of, we then lose this imagination of a child through our education and sort of this rationalist view that is impressed on us, and then it takes quite some time to rediscover it.
Yeah. Talk about the origins of your sort of romantic, the ethos in your life. I mean, was that a word that you sort of identified with at a certain point and say, gosh, this is what I am, and this is what expresses what I've been striving to do? And how did that come about?
I never really consciously used it until I wrote the book, which was in I think I started writing in 2012. And I remember that moment. I was working on the proposal with an editor and my agent, and this is my first book. And the book was supposed to be called Chief Meaning Officer. Thank God it wasn't published with that title in hindsight. But I realized as I was describing the principles of meaning making as they made sense to me in business, in and through business. And it was really an epiphany when I realized that all of these principles give more than you take, dwell in mystery and mystique, honor the silence, lose yourself, lose without losing. So lose yourself, surrender. There's others. I don't even remember them all now, but they were all romantic principles. And it struck me when I looked at them, it's like, oh my God, these are all tropes of romanticism, of the arts and literature, philosophy movement of the 18th, 19th century. That was a response to the Enlightenment. But I had never used that. I had never articulated that for me before, even though when I was 16, 17, 18, I think I've always lived my life that way. So our music, the music we made with our band Migraine, was very romantic. It was very kind of, it was full of longing and heartbreak. And also I remember the first city that I frequently drove to, because it's not that far from my hometown, 5-6 hour car drive or train ride, is Paris. So I went to Paris a lot. And Paris I really cherished and loved. For me, it was just like the most romantic destination and an escape from this rather gray industrial town that I grew up in, and sort of the German, what I thought was a very stifling, narrow German psyche at the time. So yeah, that's maybe how it all started. Paris.
What inspired you to write the book? What prompted that?
The book was, I think, the result of many years of suffering in business. So from law, which I never finished, I never got a degree. Then I studied applied cultural studies, which was a crude mix of Wittgenstein and accounting. So I had business classes, and then I had philosophy. It was interesting, and it was kind of it enabled students to pursue a career in the arts or arts management or marketing, and that's exactly where I ended up. And then I worked in Silicon Valley for a while. It was in the beginning incredibly thrilling and eye-opening and super interesting and competitive. And I sort of felt like, oh my God, this is sort of the time of my life, But after a while, I became a bit homesick, and Silicon Valley became so just adamant and fervent about dataism and considering data the only truth, and this whole idea of solutionism based on this fact that you can engineer anything, right? There's an engineering solution, not only to a software problem, but a policy problem or a relationship problem. And in fact, any problem in the world. That struck me as very myopic. And after a while in business, I think I realized, and I remember actually that there was a meeting. I was chief marketing officer at the time of the design company's parent group, which was owned by private equity, by KKR, one of the world's largest private equity firms. They were at least a large investor. And I was in board meetings, and I was just I loved the adventure of it. And I felt like a complete alien and outsider. And I loved observing it, almost like an ethnographer. But I also thought, oh my God, these guys are brilliant. They're super smart. but they have absolutely no idea about culture and sort of the tones in between, the nuances and how much damage they're doing also with their number crunching mindset to the whims and woes and nuances of culture, and how much value they're actually destroying, by merging companies and behaving that way. So I was sort of in awe, but also completely shocked. And I think that was the spark for me to say, after probably 10 years or so in executive positions, no, I need to now write down my truth. And my truth is actually hearkening back to where I came from. And it's a somewhat European, probably sentimental, romantic truth. And there is a space where I want to carve out a space for it in business. And I had begun to write and give talks. And I also felt encouraged by the fact that, they were resonant. So people just, it struck a chord, or people were interested in these ideas, which surprised me. And so then really, I think, gave me the courage to pursue this book idea.
Wow, right. Had you encountered any examples of, because I mean, often the response to that sort of critique is you're just being sentimental and naive, and business can't really run unless it's really, Taylorian, right? I mean, I was really struck by the resonances in your book and in your talks about how so much of what you were responding to seems like a new Taylorism, right? The re-engineering and even your new book around winning. I don't know if that word is in any way responding to Jack Welch. I mean, he has a memoir called Winning, or I think it's a biography written by his wife. And Welch is, I think, the kind of prototype or the archetype of this new re-engineering, the new Taylorism, right? Really kind of hyper-rationalist, very anti-humanist in some way, because you notice that he was called Neutron Jack because he would go into buildings and destroy them and leave the people, get rid of the people and leave the building standing like neutron bombs, right? So it seems like there's this sort of a call for a new romantic movement that emerges when there is a new rationalism that has taken hold. I don't know if that's accurate reading.
I think that's quite accurate, and I think that's historically always been the case, right? Whenever the pendulum swung to a very rational, super optimizing, hyper efficient mindset, when it became very binary in that sense, there was always this counter movement that was by design somewhat subversive. So I think the romantic movement back then, and if there is one right now, is coming from the pockets, right? It's coming from the underground. It's not a top-down framework, that is kind of an ideology. It's more like pockets of resistance that also makes it romantic, right? In a way.
Yeah. And were there examples that had given you confidence that business can actually work this way? It's not just a sort of sentimental reaction, but you can actually succeed in business by following these principles. Did you find any exemplars?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, it was definitely the company that I worked at the time, Frog Design, which was founded by the legendary German industrial designer Hartmut Essinger, who had worked for Apple in the 80s and 90s. And Steve Jobs, and I heard many stories about Steve Jobs because they worked very closely together, is an interesting figure in that regard, because he is both, in a way, hyper romantic, because he believes in the invisible, in the interior of products, right? And not necessarily in the metrics or the external metrics, at least. But at the same time, he's also like a hyper driven, very rational business mind, right? So he was able to reconcile both of these somewhat opposing minds and still retain the ability to function, to quote Scott Fitzgerald. So Frog was a place like that. It was, and it was very much because of the founder, Hartmut. It was a very romantic, dramatic place, full of adventure, also dark in a way, So it was very hard to read. Every day when you went there, you didn't know what to expect. Now, that can be very off-putting and unsettling, but it's also, I think, at least for me at the time, it was a million times more interesting than a work routine that would have been boring and very consistent. So I saw that as an example. And I also, for the book, then interviewed architects, startup founders. I spent time with Priya Parker, the author of the book, The Art of Gathering, which came out many years later, who had just started her practice. And we both served on the World Economic Forum Agenda Council on Values. And so we had many conversations about, there was always a conversation about ethics and doing good and conscious capitalism and purpose. But for me, that conversation always struck me as still somewhat technocratic. It was very cold. Yeah. And so I was always looking for the intimacy and the beauty that a novel or a film or any other piece of art might capture, and then express that in business. I remember that I began to host events. I ran a hackathon that was still a thing in 2010 or 2011. That was called Reimagining Work or so. That was with the World Economic Forum and some other partners. Yeah, and I think those were sort of early attempts to find the soul of business. I was inspired by the works of David Whyte, the philosopher and poet who has written a lot about corporations and beauty in a way, and corporations and meaning. I was attracted by cultures such as Chanel, the fact that they onboard executives through a really kind of Proustian sentimental education. So really kind of like honing their faculties, their sensibilities, embracing arts and reading and interpreting the world and its sublime beauty, and developing a sensorial apparatus for that rather than just being a skill-based functioning machine. And then once I had that lens on, of course, what happens is you see more, and the world is suddenly, appears romantic to you, and you see more and more businesses. I remember interviewing the founder of a series called Death Over Dinner that started in Seattle, and it became a movement in the US where people over dinner had conversations about the ultimate taboo, especially at work, which is death and grief and loss. It's also a theme, as you might remember, that we just covered quite extensively actually at our recent festival. So I think all of these things came together, and suddenly I realized, oh my God, like the reality that we were taught, that we were conditioned to embrace as the mainstream reality, it's just a narrow slice of what's happening. People want more. There is more. And now, many years later, with the House of Beautiful Business and our work and the client work that we do, but also the festivals and experiences that we put on ourselves, that's exactly what we want to create. We want to create a space to show that other side of the broader range of emotions of our humanity is possible in business. And it is.
Yeah. No, it reminds me a lot. I mean, there's a lot in the romantic critique. I think that's really important and valuable. I think it needs to constantly be brought to surface. I mean, the work I've done with scientists, in many ways, I think, I've been studying the role of beauty in science, and many of the critiques of science are, I think, similar to the critiques of rationalism, because they're all about the reductionism, right? The stripping away of mystery and of beauty. Keats, famously complained that Newton had destroyed the poetry of the rainbow by reducing it to the prismatic colors and so on. And Keats himself, he was a scientist himself. Like, he wasn't just a naive, sort of wishful thinker. Like, he was himself aware of the power and beauty of science. And yet I think he was really concerned about the way in which relying exclusively on that reductive dimension can be really problematic. And I think it's important to, even though, scientists now have started pushing back and are more willing to talk about beauty in science more openly, it's not something they focus on. And I think that's what needs to be brought to light, that even in business, even in accounting, or even in Silicon Valley, that there's a lot that is to be treasured. There's a lot of mystery and there's a lot of magic, even in the process of what seems like hyper-rationalist engineering, right? And it seems like your work is trying to shed a light on those aspects of business. Talk about the origin of the House of Beautiful Business and even the word beautiful. How did that come about?
Well, I had written this book, The Business Romantic, and it came out in 2015. And around the book, I think there was an interest in forming a community. So I wanted to do an event. That was really the spark for the first gathering. And my longtime colleague and friend, Till Grusch, also a fellow German, our paths crossed again just at the right time. So we decided to do a gathering in Barcelona in Spain. And initially the idea was really to create the most romantic business conference that the world had ever seen. Silent dinners, opera singers, exhibitions, very different kind of programming, but still, and this is, I think, a hallmark of the house, hopefully, bridging back to the pragmatic and day-to-day needs of business. So we don't want to be completely woo-woo and out there, but we want to bring fringe and unorthodox ideas to an orthodox space without alienating, I guess, the people who attend. And for that very reason, I think the term romantic, while being very useful for a book and the platform that I set out to build for this broader community, we realized it's too controversial or it's too polarizing. There's some people who read it as like HR departments, like, oh no, we don't want to be romantic. That's
right.
Or so don't want to go there. And beautiful is just a broader canvas. Everybody wants to live a beautiful life. Everybody wants beauty. Like, no one would ever raise their hand and say, no, I'm not interested in beauty. So it struck us as a really great kind of projection field. And the house, we felt like, we want to have a home for that. So a sense of belonging. But why we were tempted, we thank God, I think we never really fell prey to this desire to build something robust or an actual house, a physical building. So I think the house is really a metaphor, and it must remain virtual. So we meet every day. Once a year we meet, we host a big festival. We've now moved to Portugal. We did one online during COVID, and then we have a number of online sessions. And we now call ourselves the network for the life-centered economy, which is a term that we didn't invent. It's been around since the Club of Rome discussions, but it's so relevant and urgent now, and it's a good one. And it means that we want to create a business, and this is maybe the definition of beautiful business. It's a business that honors all life around us and all life inside us, which brings to mind emotional diversity, cognitive diversity, cultural diversity, more inclusive, more fluid, more deeper manifestations of creativity and innovation and value creation than the very reductionist sort of movement and management theory have sort of made us believe are possible. And the house has grown. It started as an event. It's evolved into a community of more than 30,000 people with more than 30 local chapters all around the world. Very vibrant community that is to a large degree self-organized. And we see ourselves as it's partly, I guess, a movement. I'm kind of careful with that term, but it's a community that is actually, I feel like, quite real now after 6 years, that has really grown roots and branches and has a real body. It's real. I think there's intimacy there as a main currency. But we also produce a lot of thought leadership. So we publish a lot, we do reports, and we do a lot of client work. So we work with many Fortune 500 companies, and we help them envision a life-centered economy. We help them map out what that might mean for them. And we help them, most importantly, to create events, experiences, and stories that touch them, that really touch them on an emotional, not only an intellectual and emotional, and a somatic, bodily level. And that's a key lever for change. So that's where we're at.
Fantastic. Could you talk a bit about the transition from human-centered to life-centered? Because I think that's one shift I've seen in your work. And the other thing, if you could touch on, is just even if you could give one example of, one of these organizations. You don't have to name the company, but just the kind of change that you've been able to bring about in trying to create this sort of life-centered business.
The human-centered economy has been the holy grail, right, for a while. I mean, it was like the lowest common denominator. Everybody could agree on human-centered products, human-centered experiences. IDEO, the design firm that was a main rival when I worked at Frog Design, that really did a remarkable job in promoting design thinking and broadening the remit of design, also really famously propagated the idea of human factors, right? So let's start with personas. Let's look at the human needs. If you look at Maslow's pyramid of needs, of course, also maybe all the ones that are a little bit more subtle, the social needs that we have, the spiritual needs that we have, and then design for that based on this premise that the human is at the center of all things. And that would inevitably lead to a more humane economy. The shift that we have made, and I think the world is also making, if I sort of scan the world around me correctly, is this realization that that's just not good enough, and has led to so many externalities, whether that is our mental health, sort of this focus on we need to optimize our humanity in a way and bring most of our humanity and bring it to work. It has led to a lot of disconnection and alienation from nature, from the other. It has led to the fact that I think convenience and comfort have probably been over-indexed when designing workplace and product experiences. And I think most importantly, of course, climate change and the climate crisis and the damage that we've done to our natural habitat. And also, I think the disneglect for other life, other species around us, has probably to do with the fact that we've had this very human-centered, myopic mindset. So the life-centered economy goes beyond that. As I said earlier, it acknowledges all life inside us. So not just the positive emotions, not just experiences that are designed to make us happy all the time, but also workplaces that allow us to be sad and angry and inconsistent and complicated and struggling, because that's who we are. And hard to read and unintelligible. And then secondly, I think it's an economy that honors all life around us, as in heightening, expanding our consciousness, being aware of the cycles of nature, whether that's the circular economy or designing work more in a cyclical fashion where there's moments of rest and harvesting and recharging and rebirth and grief, as nature sort of tells us. So I think those are, and also I think a renaissance of the spiritual and the physical, the somatic, like reconnecting with the soil, with the earth, with our bodies and the knowledge that it contains, not just the intellectual knowledge that we have in our heads, and also with spiritual practices. It's a word that I would not have used 5-6 years ago. It didn't use it in my book. Now I feel like the business world is ready for it, and we see it pop up.
Beauty at Work is brought to you by Templeton Religion Trust. If you enjoyed this clip, go check out the full episode. And please take a moment to subscribe and leave us a review. It really helps get the word out about the show. Thanks, and see you next time.